Welcome to the Coffee Before Pants weekly feature, this week in literary, film, and music history. This was, from what I can tell, a busy week in history, so much so it was difficult to decide which events to cover and which to leave out. Thanks for listening, by the way. Hit the like button or the subscribe button below to get the notifications of new videos. At the end of the video, I will also show you how you can support me in a small way financially. That being said, let's dive into the history of the week of June 1st. June 1st, 1937, vocalist Billie Holiday records I'll Never Be the Same with a band led by pianist Teddy Wilson, including tenor saxophonist Lester Young. I'll Never Be the Same is a popular song based on an instrumental called Little Buttercup, written by Matty Malnick and Frank Cinarelli. After several musicians had recorded the instrumental version, lyrics were written by Gus Kahn. June 1st, 1937, novelist Edith Wharton collapsed from a heart attack at the home of Ogden Codman, a prominent architect and decorator. Uh, Wharton died from a stroke 2 months later. June 1st, 1968, Simon and Garfunkel topped the Billboard Hot 100 with Mrs. Robinson. The song, which was featured in the film The Graduate, won the duo a Grammy in 1969. June 2nd, 1840, Victorian poet and novelist Thomas Hardy was born in Dorset, England. Hardy was incredibly prolific. He wrote 14 novels, 3 volumes of short stories, and several poems between the years 1871 and 1897. His most well-known novels are Tess of the D'Urberville, Far from the Madding Crowd, Jude the Obscure, and The Mayor of Casterbridge. June 2nd, 1964, multi-reed man Eric Dolphy records Last Date. Last Date, a live album, was released early in 1965 on Limelight Records. It was recorded June 2nd, 1964 in Hilversum, Holland, shortly after Dolphy had settled in Paris, France, following a tour with Charles Mingus. Dolphy is accompanied by the Misha Mengelberg Trio on the album. June 2nd, 1989, The Dead Poets Society premieres. The film was directed by Peter Weir and starred Robin Williams and Ethan Hawke. The film received numerous accolades, including Academy Award nominations for Best Picture and Best Director, as well as a Best Actor nomination for Robin Williams. June 3rd, 1926 marks the birthday of beat poet and general iconoclast Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg was an American poet and writer, as many of you probably know. As a student at Columbia University in 1940s, he began friendships with Lucien Carr, William S. Burroughs, and Jack Kerouac, forming the core of the Beat generation. He vigorously opposed militarism, economic materialism, and sexual repression, and he embodied various aspects of the counterculture with his views on drugs, sex, multiculturalism, hostility to bureaucracy, and openness to Eastern religions. He and Bob Dylan met in 1963 and were lifetime friends. Best known for his poem Howl, Ginsberg denounced what he saw as the destructive forces of capitalism and conformity in the United States. San Francisco police and U.S. Customs seized copies of Howl in 1956, and a subsequent obscenity trial in 1957 attracted widespread publicity. Presiding Judge Clayton W. Horn ruled that Howl was not obscene, asking, would there be any freedom of press or speech if one must reduce his vocabulary to vapid, innocuous euphemisms? We could use a few more judges like Mr. Clayton Horn. June 3rd, 1968, on this date, Valerie Solanas shot Andy Warhol and art critic and curator Mario Amaya at Warhol Studio in New York City. Solanas had been to see Warhol after asking for the return of a script which had been apparently misplaced. Warhol was seriously wounded in the attack and barely survived. Solanas was charged with attempted murder, assault, and illegal possession of a firearm, and was subsequently sentenced to 3 years in prison. June 3rd, 2005, Alexandre Dumas' The Night of Saint-Armine was published, 135 years after the author's death. The nearly finished novel was discovered in newspaper archives after it had been serialized in a French newspaper and later forgotten. Dumas historian Claude Schopp made the discovery when researching the author. Schopp said, "You can imagine my surprise when, among the reels and reels of microfilmed archives, I stumbled upon an almost complete serialized novel entitled The Night of Saint-Hermine and was signed by Alexandre Dumas. The work was complete except for the last section and still reached over 900 pages." June 3rd, 2016, English folk musician and singer-songwriter Dave Swarbrick died, aged 75. His work for the group Fairport Convention from 1969 has been credited with leading them to produce their seminal album, Leaf and Leaf, which was 1969, which initiated the electric folk movement. This is an amazing album, especially the vocals of the late Sandy Denny. If you haven't listened to this LP, you are certainly missing out. June 4th, 1973, Harlem Renaissance poet Arna Bontam passed away from a heart attack in his home in Nashville. Bontam was a celebrated poet and novelist and collaborated once on a children's book with Langston Hughes. June 5th, 1852, abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe published her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in serial form in the newspaper The National Era. The narrative was originally meant to be much shorter, but it was immediately popular, and several protests were even staged when Stowe missed an issue. June 5th, 1941 marks the birthday of Spalding Gray. He was an American actor, novelist, playwright, screenwriter, and performance artist. He is best known for the autobiographical monologues that he wrote and performed for the theater in the 80s and 90s, as well as for his film adaptation of these works. He wrote and starred in several, working with different directors. Gray achieved renown for his monologue, Swimming to Cambodia, which he adapted as a 1987 film in which he starred, directed by Jonathan Demme. Other of his monologues that he adapted for film were Monster in a Box, directed by Nick Broomfield, and Grey's Anatomy, 1996, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Gray died by suicide at the age of 62 after jumping into the New York harbor on January the 11th, 2004. He had been struggling with depression and severe injuries following a car accident. Soderbergh made a documentary film about Gray's life called And Everything is Going Fine in 2010. June 5th, 1975, during recording sessions for Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here at Abbey Road Studios, London, England, Syd Barrett turned up out of the blue as the band was listening to playbacks of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, a song that happened to be about Syd Barrett. By that time, the 29-year-old Barrett had shaved off all of his hair, including his eyebrows, become overweight, and his ex-bandmates did not at first recognize him. Barrett eventually left without saying goodbye, and none of the band members ever saw him again. June 5th, 2002, Dee Dee Ramone, also known as Douglas Glenn Colvin, bass guitarist with the Ramones, died at his Hollywood, California apartment of a heroin overdose at the age of 49. He was the group's primary songwriter, penning such songs as Rockaway Beach, 53rd and 3rd, and Poison Heart. June 7th, 1943, poet and author Nikki Giovanni was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Giovanni is one of the world's most popular poets, having won many prestigious awards, including the Langston Hughes Medal, the NAACP Image Award, and a Grammy Award for spoken word. She was a contributing voice to the civil rights movement in the 60s. June 1967, trumpeter Miles Davis records Nefertiti with his quintet, including Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. It was recorded at Columbia's 30th Street Studio over 4 dates between June 7th and July 19th, 1967, and was Davis's last fully acoustic album. Davis himself did not contribute any compositions. 3 are by tenor saxophonist Wayne Shorter, 2 by pianist Herbie Hancock, and 1 by drummer Tony Williams. June 7, 2015 marks the death of Sir Christopher Lee. In a career spanning more than 60 years, Lee became known as an actor with a deep and commanding voice who often portrayed villains in horror and franchise films. Lee gained fame for portraying Count Dracula in 7 Hammer horror films. Other notable roles were the creature in Hammer's Curse of Frankenstein, Scaramanga in the ninth James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun, and Lord Summerisle in The Wicker Man, 1973. As you may know, especially if you watched This Week in History last week, Lee died just days after his 93rd birthday. Before I close, I'd like to share a short anecdote about Christopher Lee. In 1996, Lee hosted the television series 100 Years of Horror. Each episode had a different focus, like one was for zombies, another was for vampires, so on and so forth. On the werewolves episode, Lee mentioned the movie Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. And Lee related that he was in that movie and said, quote, and frankly, I don't know what I was thinking. End quote. That about wraps it up for this week. I will be back next Sunday with another This Week in Literary, Film, and Music History, brought to you by Coffee Before Pants. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. Until next week.